Hello everybody, welcome back to the book log. Today I'm going to be talking about 1Q84 by Haruki Murakami. I think I'm going to start this review by talking about what I think it means for a book to be an epic. 1Q84 is often categorized this way, which makes sense. I think objectively speaking, you almost have to categorize any 1200 page novel this way. But at the same time, there's something here that doesn't quite fit the bill. Epics are like sprawling and grandiose with ensemble casts and long winding journeys. But 1Q84 to me never really comes across that way. It is incredibly long and there is undoubtedly a lot going on in the plot and with these characters, but at the same time, it's very insular and introspective and subtle, at least more so than how you would typically imagine a book of this size to be. Everything happens within a relatively small area and happens to relatively few characters. It's certainly a deep and complex and layered story, but I wouldn't say that it sprawls. Not that any of this is necessarily a problem, but you know, it's kind of hard to justify a book of this length without some other elements. Like, what could you possibly talk about for 1200 pages and keep the story interesting and propulsive? Does 1Q84 pull it off? Well, I'd say it's a complicated question to unpack, so preemptive apology for the length of this review. This book begins as two separate narrative POVs, one following a woman named Aomame and one following a man named Tango, both living somewhere in Tokyo. Throughout a very large portion of the beginning of this book, these two storylines are completely separate. Aomame is a fitness instructor who is occasionally contracted by a wealthy old dowager to carry out covert assassinations of powerful sexual and domestic abusers. She has a very unique assassination method which involves taking an incredibly long and thin needle and plunging it into a very precise spot on the back of the victim's neck in such a way that their spinal cord is severed with almost no trace of evidence whatsoever, making the deaths look like a heart attack. Tango, meanwhile, is a cram school teacher and an aspiring writer who has a lot of technical talent but struggles to come up with interesting story ideas. He also occasionally works with a publisher to review new stories from young writers, where one day he encounters a manuscript called Air Chrysalis, written by an incredibly strange 17-year-old girl named Fuka Eri. The story is terribly written, riddled with grammatical errors, but is nonetheless incredibly compelling. Tango's publisher friend Komatsu devises a scheme where Tango uses his technical talent to rewrite Air Chrysalis as a ghostwriter in order to polish the story into something special, combining his knack for writing with Fuka Eri's knack for ideas. This is the general frame for this book, and from here, these two storylines go in a variety of directions, but slowly but surely, over a long span of time, they begin to converge. These two characters, Aomame and Tango, turn out to be connected for a couple of reasons, but in order to explain that, I guess I have to talk about 1Q84 and like what that even means. On a literal level, it's a pun based on the year 1984, which is when this book takes place. In Japanese, the number 9 is pronounced roughly like Q, so 1984 and 1Q84 sound the same when spoken aloud. In the very first chapter of the book, Aomame is riding in a taxi that is stopped on an expressway in bumper-to-bumper traffic. The taxi driver makes a bunch of these ominous remarks about how, like, not everything is what it seems, then lets Aomame know that there is an emergency stairway exit she can take leading right down from the highway overpass. Aomame takes this mysterious random stairway exit, like, to get out of the traffic, and after this point, she slowly begins to realize that she has crossed into an alternate dimension, which she calls 1Q84, the Q standing for question. There's also some loose comparison to George Orwell's 1984, but none of that ever really landed for me, so I'm just going to ignore it. The main difference between the old world and this new dimension that Aomame has entered, and a motif that the book returns to constantly, is that there are now two moons in the sky. There is the regular moon that everyone knows and loves, and there is also now a smaller, misshapen, vaguely green moon floating nearby. I'll end up talking more about that later, but the other difference she notices is that police officers are suddenly carrying heavier weapons than they were previously. Like, she's absolutely certain that until now, police had much lighter pistols and protective gear and whatnot. She discovers that the reason for this is that in this alternate universe, the police recently had a major shootout with this revolutionary religious cult named Akebono, which was an offshoot of a less violent revolutionary religious cult named Sakigake. And as a result of this confrontation, the Japanese police decided to upgrade their weapons. Coincidentally, Aomame is soon tasked with assassinating assassinating the leader of this same mysterious religious organization, as the Dowager has discovered that he is a serial pedophile rapist, essentially. And this is where the connection between Aomame and Tango comes into play, because remember Fukaeri, the weird teenager whose book is being ghostwritten by Tango? Well, she also happens to be the daughter of the leader of Sakigake who Aomame is tasked with killing. Tango has somehow also slipped into this alternate dimension, and now his fate is tied together with Aomame's as they become tied up with this religious cult in their own respective ways. Sakigake is after Aomame, obviously, because she assassinates their leader, but they're also after Tango for more enigmatic reasons. Haruki Murakami is known for dabbling in magical realism and for including a lot of surreal, abstract, sometimes completely inscrutable elements into his work, and this is where we get a lot of that. In order to explain, I'll have to talk about Air Chrysalis, which is the book that Fukaeri/Tango wrote. The plot of this book is slowly revealed throughout the story, but the gist of it is that it's a first-person narrative of Fukaeri's experiences living inside the walls of the Sakigake religious cult. The book is filled with all sorts of strange, dreamlike elements, including the little people, who are these small supernatural beings who emerge out of a dead goat carcass's mouth and proceed to construct an air chrysalis, which is a cocoon-like structure woven out of strands of air that works to birth a clone version of Fukaeri. In this case, although it doesn't have to be Fukaeri necessarily, the little people do all this in order to be able to communicate spiritual secrets to Leader and for them to impose their control on him in some undefined way. Saying it out loud like that makes it sound like insane nonsense, and I suppose it sort of is, but again, these things are explored very slowly over the course of like 1,000 pages. And all of that is to say that the reason Sakigake is after Tango is because it turns out that the plot of Air Chrysalis is completely real and all actually happened, and they don't want their organizational secrets to get out into the public. This book also becomes a bestseller because people think it's like an interesting, compelling, fantastical fiction story written by an unknown up-and-coming author rather than interpreting it as a real-life story. I realize now that none of this sounds subtle or insular or like any of those other things I said before, but I think the pace of this book makes some of these eccentric elements a lot more digestible. Everything has a lot of time to breathe, and the wacky stuff isn't necessarily on every page. There's also another more prosaic aspect to Aomame and Tango's connection, which is that they actually went to the same elementary school and were in a class together once when they were 10. Even though the two of them weren't friends or even acquaintances, they had a sort of unspoken connection through their family life. Aomame grew up with a strictly religious family who were part of a doomsday cult called the Society of Witnesses. Aomame's mom would bring her door to door to proselytize to strangers about the end of the world. Similarly, Tango's dad was an NHK fee collector who brought Tango with him door to door as he attempted to collect payment from Tokyo's citizens for their use of public television. The two of them would occasionally see each other in passing as their parents dragged them along to do their respective tasks. Aomame was somewhat of an outcast in school, but one day when Tango stood up for her to some bullies, Aomame briefly held Tango's hand, and for some reason this brief moment had a profound effect on both of them, and now 20 years later it is a moment that they both think about often. Even before their paths became intertwined through this Sakigake situation, they already had some vague notion that they wanted to reconnect with each other someday. At this point I should probably also bring up Ushikawa. 1Q84 is split up into 3 books, and the first 2 just alternate POVs between Aomame and Tango. In the third book, however, Ushikawa is added as a third POV character in the rotation. I think Ushikawa is a very interesting and compelling character, which I'll get to, but I did find his inclusion as a POV character to be a bit confounding at first, just having been so used to following solely the other 2. Ushikawa is a private investigator hired by Sakigake to do some reconnaissance on both Aomame for assassinating Leader and Tango for divulging Sakigake secrets through Air Chrysalis. I thought the way Murakami portrayed him was super fascinating because on one hand he's described as this disgusting, ugly, cretinous worm who is unpleasant to look at and interact with in every conceivable way, and I'm not even being dramatic, Murakami describes this guy in a hilariously over-the-top way, but at the same time he's very cunning and intelligent and intuitive, and as a result he's a great private investigator. In general, I did think book 3 was the slowest of the 3, primarily because Aomame is essentially hiding out in one spot, doing nothing the whole time, so Ushikawa did add a needed level of intensity and forward action, and he ultimately had a very moving, very tragic demise that gave some much-needed commotion to an otherwise kind of slow portion of the novel. I'm at the point in the review where I've kind of lost my train of thought, so I'm just going to discuss a few other things that I thought were interesting or worth discussing in some way. Like I said earlier, Murakami has a penchant for introducing some strange element into the story and then not explaining it, so there's nothing I can really do besides chance mention it and say, that was an interesting idea. One of my favorite examples has to do with Tango's father and NHK fee collecting in general. I explained earlier how Tango's father would drag him door to door as a child to use as a sympathy token to try to get people to pay their NHK fees. But there's actually a lot more going on with Tango's father in this book, such as the fact that he might not actually even be Tango's father at all. But one of my favorite aspects to his character is that at a certain point in the book, he's on his deathbed and Tango frequently makes visits to his nursing home in Chiba. He's in a coma and he can't communicate, but somehow his spirit is able to leave his body and wander around Tokyo trying to collect NHK fees from Aomame, Fukaeri, and Ushikawa. There are multiple scenes where all these characters are sitting in silence as an NHK fee collector is pounding on their door, berating them, and using all sorts of psychological tactics to try to get them to open the door and pay the fee. It's never said explicitly, but it is heavily implied several times that these unknown and unexplained encounters were the spirit of Tango's father making the rounds one more time before he passed away, further solidifying this ephemeral, otherworldly connection between all of these characters and their storylines. There's so much more to mention. I couldn't possibly explain every component of this book in a concise review. It's just too long, too much happens. I never mentioned Professor Ebisuno, Fukaeri's guardian, who devises this whole scheme to figure out what happened to Fukaeri's parents. I never mentioned Aomame's weird fling with the policewoman Ayumi, or her relationship with the dowager's ruthless and enigmatic bodyguard Tamaru, nor did I mention Tango's relationship with his older girlfriend, who one day mysteriously disappears without a trace, or the three nurses who work at his father's nursing home, including Kumi Adachi, who has a supernatural owl living near her apartment. I feel like I reserve the right to just mention those things without any explanation, because that's more or less how they're presented in the book itself. Weird things just happen. The world is strange and unexplainable and inscrutable, and I think that's just a part of its beauty. It's so easy to get lost in, and it's so long that at a certain point you just start to take these strange elements as a fact of reality. It's not weird, it just is what it is. I think this also adds a lot of depth and emotion to Aomame and Tango's relationship and their eventual reunion. Their connection transcends the unknowable mysteries of the universe. They are truly soulmates. At points, the book gets maybe too weird, too repetitive, too uncomfortable. The book is definitely unnecessarily horny at points. But then Murakami will hit you with these achingly beautiful meditations on love and life and the world and the strange ways in which it operates. I thought Aomame and Tango were beautifully rendered characters, and the way they are slowly, inexorably drawn together over the course of 1,200 pages is really amazing to behold. It's not a perfect book, but it's the kind of book that justifies its imperfections in other ways. It's wholly itself, if that makes sense. It's the most 1Q84 book you could imagine, and I can't help but respect it for that. I'm gonna give it 8.